I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right, for this episode of Dustbowl Diatribes, we're honored to have on James Murphy of the St. Martin de Porres House in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. James, thanks for coming on, and could you give us a bit of a background of you and what your house is up to?
Okay, yeah, thanks for inviting me. Maurin Academy is awesome. You guys do great work. And so, yeah, James Murphy. I'm originally from Rochester, New York. That's where I was born and raised. One of 8 kids, and raised in a pretty, my family, we raised Catholic, so I'm a cradle Catholic, but I would say I left, like many young people after confirmation and throughout college and, maybe into my 30s, I would say I was like out of the church. And through kind of like when Pope Francis became Pope, I became very interested again in Catholicism. And through some really kind of like weird twists and turns, I found myself reading Father Dan Berrigan. He wrote a book called No Bars to Manhood. And I remember reading it, and he was talking about things that really, I felt like he was writing a letter to me. And, he talks about how we all want peace, but we don't want to lose our status in society. We don't want to lose our jobs. We don't want to, so we end up not doing very much in terms of trying to change the world. And I was just very moved by, he wrote this while he was in prison for the Catonsville 9 action in Baltimore, or in Catonsville, Maryland, I think. And so this is kind of a prison diary of his. And yeah, it just really struck me to see someone who would put their freedom on the line for something that they believed in, that was so grounded in Catholic values and like pacifism. And and he talks about Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin in there, mostly Dorothy Day. I think he was kind of concerned that Dorothy did not like his action, that it was too violent, or just there was property. They destroyed some property. They broke into where they keep draft notices and things like that. So he was worried about that, and I just remember he mentioned her a few times, and I just kind of filed that away. And then when Pope Francis became Pope, I was very moved by his treatment and talking of the poor all the time, and I just thought, like, I'm not doing anything. And I Googled shelters in Rochester, New York, and the first thing that popped up was St. Joe's House of Hospitality. and I didn't even know there was a Catholic worker in Rochester. And I started volunteering there for a couple nights, or one night a week for 2 years. And that was kind of my introduction into the Catholic worker. And, after my daughter graduated college around 2014 or 2015, I decided I would move into St. Joe's for 1 year to try it out, just as a mission. That was my idea. I'm going to do a mission for 1 year, and I just never really left the Catholic worker. So now I'm at St. So I started in Rochester. I went to New York City for a little bit, 3 years at St. Joe's and Mary House in New York City, and for 2 years was in Chicago at the Canterbury House, which was a kind of an attempt to embed a parish and a Catholic worker, kind of a Catholic worker embedded in a parish and the life of a parish. And then in September of 2024, Renee Roden, my partner, we decided to come here to Harrisburg. There was a house that had kind of been dormant for a few years, and we took it over. And now we live in Harrisburg. We're in a neighborhood called Allison Hill. It's a very poor immigrant neighborhood. We live across the street from St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church. Probably 80% of the parishioners are primarily Spanish speaking. So yeah, we have a 10,000 square foot farm, not very close to our property. And we have a little row house in a very kind of busy area, a very poor area of Harrisburg. There's a whole lot going on here, but we'll just keep the conversation going. Maybe it'll come back to where we are.
Just an aside, who is Saint Martin de Porres?
Saint Martin de Porres is he's the first Black saint in the Americas. I think maybe the only Black saint in the Americas. He was a Dominican brother, and experienced a lot of I think he's 15th, 16th century, and he administered to a lot of. He was a former slave, and he was kind of like a doctor in a way, but without being a doctor. But he took care of the sick, and he lived. The Dominicans wouldn't let him become a priest or become a brother, and just very quietly did the humble work of a Dominican friar. And today he is the patron saint of anti-racism. He's the patron saint of biracial marriages. There have been two houses that I know of in the Catholic worker that have been named after him. One was started here in Harrisburg. This house actually was started in the 1930s by a woman by the name of Mary Fricon. And she was good friends with Dorothy Day. And then there was Llewellyn Scott opened Blessed Martin de Porres in the 1930s as well. Hospice in Washington, D.C. Llewellyn Scott was African-American in D.C. Mary Fricon was a white woman living in Harrisburg.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I had not, this is probably like, a problem, is that I hadn't heard of him before. So, and I suspect a lot of other people have not. So thank you for introducing him to us. We did want to talk a little bit about, we'll get back around to like the specific experiences you have there, but we wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between the Catholic worker movement and politics and how you see that relationship. Do you see the Catholic worker movement as primarily a political movement, social movement or an alternative to politics? How do you conceptualize it with your experience?
I mean, I think the Catholic worker is, well, I think, you know, Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin kind of stressed this a lot, was the primacy of the spiritual. Um, so I don't think it was really, I've never seen it as a political movement. Political, I guess, in the sense of politics that we have today, or I don't think they viewed that I don't think they saw politics as a way of reconstructing the social order, which I think is a major part of why the Catholic worker was started, was to, was to create a new society in the shell of the old. And I don't think politics, had much to do with it. I think they saw it in a very, I think they looked at it more from the bottom up, more of um, a grassroots movement, very much based on, the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution for Peter and Dorothy was more about the 6th, 7th century Irish monks who had reconstructed the social order, after the fall of the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions, going out, leaving Ireland, and, going out to mainland Europe and starting monasteries. And, Peter Maurin like to use the word agronomic universities. So yeah, creating these little communities, monastic communities, that re-educated, re-Christianized Europe, and kind of laid the foundations of medieval Europe. And I think and those little communities, those little Irish communities, they would create other monasteries. And before you knew it, you had kind of a loose network of monasteries, in France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Peter used to say that they went as far as Constantinople. But yeah, they changed, I think, the hearts and minds of the people. And I think politics is more of a bottom or a top-down effort. And I think maybe at some point the American political system worked. I don't feel it's functioning in any way right now. I think the institutions, whether they be political, social, religious, they're just broken across the board, it seems. And it really does feel like what Peter and Dorothy were talking about in terms of this, this example of the Irish monks, and the way he described it was the 3 C's: cult, culture, cultivation. So prayer, liturgy, education, and roundtable discussions, and then kind of work, farming, crafts, things like that, and kind of synthesizing these things, and creating new institutions. And I think that's where I think the movement is. I think that's what it was created for. That's what it was. It's there to teach us these efforts, giving us ideas, and then trying to carry them out. I mean, Peter and Dorothy talked about Catholic action and not political action. And knowing this was coming up, I pulled up a couple of easy essays and writings from Dorothy Day. But one is from a quote from June 1934 from an easy essay by Peter Maurin: "Is political action an answer?" And someone had written to Peter asking him, why don't we create a Catholic political party and solve the problems of the day? And he writes, yeah, our Holy Father, Pope Pius XI in this case, does not ask us to reconstruct the social order through Catholic political action, but through Catholic social action. And I think that Catholic action, capital C, capital A, is very prominent in the 1930s in the writings of Dorothy and in the paper. And I think it's that type of grassroots action that they're talking about. So, yeah, I think I see a lot of bishops today, or Catholics, and they're kind of like celebrating Supreme Court decisions. It feels like our political system is getting more Christian or Catholic or evangelical, but society as a whole is not. And so we're really not doing anything to change the hearts and minds of society at large, but rather just trying to legislate, force down people's throats, values that, whether they're right or wrong, it doesn't create an environment that people are like, oh, wow, Christians are really great. And, so we're not living out being Christian. We're just trying to, it feels like, legislate it. So there's kind of that going on as well. That for me is real. As soon as I get involved in a situation and it feels very political, I kind of withdraw immediately. It's just not where I want to be. I just don't feel it is going to bear much fruit. So I don't know if that answers the question.
But briefly, how would you characterize what social action or Catholic action / Catholic social action should look like in practice? Like, what were Maurin and Day hoping for?
Well, I think they were really looking at the economic situation of the 1930s and kind of capitalism in general, and not seeing much hope in a capitalistic, in a future that would be fair and equal to everyone under a capitalistic system. And also, they looked to the communists or the socialist collectivists, and while they agreed a lot with what they had to say in principle, they had a very different outlook on the way things maybe should be or ought to be. So when I think of Catholic action, and what they maybe intended, or I think it had more to do with cooperatives and being cooperators, and controlling the means of production, not by the state or by a select few wealthy, powerful businessmen, but by the workers. So worker-owned cooperatives, capital being collectivized in credit unions, and then land. Even though they spoke, especially Peter, he spoke very strongly about that private property was good and a right. But I think they also viewed communal owned property as being very important. So in the way I think that was expressed today would be community land trusts. So like those are some of the means, or some of the like you can create. Catholic action to me is creating a worker-owned cooperative. Catholic action is trying to create a community land trust or a credit union. These can be all done on very local, very, very local places. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to do this, but you do need to be a cooperator. And I think that's very difficult to do in the United States, because we're so formed in capitalism. We're so formed in individualism. But I do think that Catholic action kind of falls into that realm of creating cooperatives. whether economic, land, or worker cooperatives.
Oh, maybe this would be a good time to ask you what kind of obstacles that you've personally encountered in all of your experiences, obstacles to cooperation, right? You mentioned the, overarching influence of capitalism. So maybe explain like how our context, in your view, creates the obstacles, and then maybe like if you have some at least generic examples of what you're talking about to kind of like
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's a great easy essay. One of my favorite series of easy essays is the November 1934 or 1933, and he talks about the bishop's program, which was a document that had come out in 1919 called a program of social reconstruction by the bishops. It was written after World War I, and in a lot of ways, a very radical document. It doesn't read well today because they were trying to figure out what to do with all the women who had entered the workforce while the men went off to fight. So it's kind of icky in some ways, but when it came to cooperatives, they talk about worker-owned cooperatives or employee-owned businesses. They even kind of talk about like no more like getting rid of the wage system eventually, and it's a pretty shocking read, and it was quickly dismissed as being too socialist. But yeah, it was. Peter says it was disparate for lack of cooperators, and so I think like that we're not formed in that way. Even though Catholicism is about community, even the liturgy is the work of the people. When we go up to receive communion, we go up in a line together as though we're walking towards Christ. So we're supposed to be cooperating. We were making the bread, making the music. The clergy have their role. The laity have their role. But we're just not formed in that. And the very first cooperative I tried to start was in Rochester, and we were going to make coffins for the indigent, and we had this whole plan. And the more people we brought in to kind of help us, to give us the expertise, where I wanted to be the workers who own this, and mostly people from the street, but very slowly, because a cooperative was so foreign to the people helping, they couldn't wrap their arms around it. And I didn't understand that they didn't understand either, and that they didn't know what a cooperative was. And so it quickly became a jobs program. And so like this idea of a worker-owned cooperative in theory worked well, but once you brought in the expertise, once you brought in outside people, it's just too foreign. And we ended up starting later on St. Joe's in Rochester. We helped to start a community land trust, and it's still around. I mean, I don't know how well it's doing now, but we spent almost 8 months educating ourselmes and reading about cooperatives, and so that was a very different experience where we took the time to educate ourselves and whatnot. But like, I really think if we are going to reconstruct the social order, if the American Catholic Church is ever to pull away from the economic systems that are very unjust, they're really going to have to play a large role in creating cooperators. And I think that's a space that the Catholic worker movement can be in terms of, because that's really what it takes, is formation as as cooperators. It takes a lot of formation, and I don't think we're close to it right now at all. You know, when you talk about worker-owned cooperatives, you spend most of your time trying to convince people you're not a communist. That seems to be the you know.
Would you say the average Catholic worker is a well-formed cooperator?
No, I mean, any Americans aren't. I'm not. You know, I'm a lot better than I was. You know, when I first came to the Catholic Worker, I was kind of confused why they had a problem with capitalism. You know, I was very like, what is this? And, you know, why are they so vocal about this? Because I was a capitalist. That's how I was raised. That's how I'd done okay in life. I didn't realize that the system was really, favored towards someone like me. You know, someone who had a degree, someone who was white, someone who was a man, who had connections, and you know, so it took a long time. And I think, you know, Dorothy Day, even though I think people think that as soon as she met Peter Maurin that she knew all this stuff, she didn't. Like, Dorothy Day didn't know what a credit union was or a worker-owned cooperative until the summer of 1934, a full, you know, 13, 14 months after the movement had been formed. And, you know, so like that formation, you know, so her formation was ongoing, as I think all of ours are. And I think, but yeah, I don't think any American is formed well or has when it comes to cooperation. And I don't think Catholic workers are immune from it. I think you have to be very focused on tending to that, and it can be done in a lot of different ways. You know, you can organize a house where it is cooperatively run. You can organize, you know, programs, you know, farms, whatever, that there's forced, you have to cooperate, that not one person or two people are in charge. But it takes a lot of formation and takes a lot of reading. I think, you know, like reading the people that Peter and Dorothy were reading Mounier and Marita. I mean, they talk about all this stuff. You know, even cooperatives. So yeah, I think it's really important in terms of formation, and, you know, not only for Catholic workers, but for anyone, that, yeah, we really begin. I think that's why American Catholics don't understand synodality. I think it's partly we just aren't formed in a way, like we're looking for results. You know, like if we have a meeting, there's got to be results. And I don't think synodality is about that. I think synodality is more about listening and cooperation, and not like, oh, we're gonna have a few meetings and then we're gonna have a checklist of things to do. It's more about being formed by the people you're listening to, by the people you're in communion with. And so yeah, I wish I could say we have, like, we're going to become great cooperators tomorrow, but I think it's going to take time or some sort of, you know, like an earthquake. Like Dorothy Day talks about the earthquake in San Francisco, and how, yeah, after that destruction and that, you know, all that trauma, people came together and worked together. And so I think it's in us naturally to be that way. I hope it doesn't come down to something like that, but, you know, whether it be like an economic collapse or, you know, but there are points where I think humanity recognizes, wow, we really need to come together. And So it could be that way as well. But I think it'd be a lot better if we could just really try to form ourselves and each other in the movement, in our communities, in our parishes, um, to become more cooperative and just generally cooperators.
So, like, what kind of personal qualities do you think it takes to be that type of person? And then, kind of in the same zone is like a question I've had forever is like, how formal do things need to be? In other words, does it help or hurt if people have like a very formalized agreement and kind of like a constitution? Or is that, like almost saying we don't trust each other from the start, so
Mm.
you know what I'm saying? In your experience, like which works?
Well, what do you like when you say like what are you talking about? Like a formalized constitution or
Yeah, like something that
rule or
if you're gonna be a part of this Catholic worker farm, here's this 5-page document that states what your responsibilities are, that states like how you will be able to participate in
yeah,
decision making and voting, how decisions will be made, just all those expectations so that you go into it pretty much fully informed. But that, I mean, whenever I've contemplated doing something like that in my own personal life, it's because I don't trust other people, right? So
yeah,
there's this tension.
yeah. Like we have, we do hospitality hours here at the house, and volunteers come, um, and we don't really have a program, so to speak. You just kind of come and hang out and have coffee, and you meet people, and but I think slowly, like they begin to learn, like what I wouldn't say rules, but what the process is. How do we handle situations? I wouldn't say our farm is like good enough to give an example on that, but I think a lot of the information that we transmit, and I think in the Catholic worker in general, it's really through personal relationships and getting to know people, and then allowing yourself to be known. Um, I think it's more along those lines. The smaller, the better. The less confusion there is. I think it's when you get big that, yeah, you really kind of have to begin to write things down, and so maybe small is a better way to transmit this stuff without there being this tremendous formality to everything that we seem to do. I think writing it down, maybe having a process as opposed to rules, like. But I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I wouldn't want to write anything down personally. Um, you know, in Rochester, there was a good decision making process. There was a weekly meeting, and you know, everyone had to find consensus, and nothing was really written down. It was you went to the meetings, and you couldn't make decisions for like 3 or 6 months. I can't remember. But you would just sit there in these meetings, and you would hear, and you would listen, you would learn, you would talk to people afterwards, you would ask questions. By the time you could become part of the decision making body, you kind of knew how things operated without you sign on this line. I'm going to follow all these rules, and so it was done. It was all, and it was a bigger operation than most Catholic workers, St. Joe's, but a very small kind of group of decision makers, which made it easier. But so there was a lot of disharmony in other aspects. But when it came to making decisions, they did a really good job. So like it can be done. But yeah, I think it takes, there's got to be some way of people learning how things are done. And the trust, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that was
You
going to
know,
be my question, like how much of it really was like people understood how things were done versus was there basically like a core of solidarity and trust such that, basically consensus could actually work itself out, if that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, like I remember being very opposed to some of the decisions and just telling myself, I would just say, okay, like the group has been right before, and I'm going to trust that I'm going to trust that this is the right way to do it, whatever that decision wants. And typically that's how it went. I mean, there were times where people could kind of like, team up and, have little sidebars outside of, a meeting. But I don't think that you couldn't really like, because there was consensus, you couldn't have factions. It's either everyone agreed or they didn't, or no one agreed. And, typically what would happen was the decision wasn't that important that someone would feel like I have to, I'm gonna lay down my life on this particular decision that needs to be made. Most people would just say I disagree, but I'm not going to block it, and but I don't. Yeah, the trust part. Yeah, I don't think oftentimes there was a lot of trust as well, but there was, I think, trust in a process that had worked for quite some time, and I think people trusted the process maybe more than each other, if that makes sense. I think what's important is that there was a process, and I think even though it was written down, the people at the table knew what the process was. So it didn't necessarily always have to be based on trust. That we're all trying to make a good decision. Does that make sense?
I think so. But then would it be fair to say people trusted I guess maybe, I think you did say this, they trusted the process.
Yeah, I think the process was more trusted oftentimes than the people.
The persons.
Than the persons. Yeah.
But you see, if the process is not like written down or known from the start, you're almost forced to trust people that you don't know. And that is, in my politically sensitive brain, a very political move that kind of like almost coerces a person to kind of hang in there and see if they can conform. I'm just being a little bit of a contrarian because I've been in a few situations like that and felt like I don't even know what the magic mojo is to this group, and it's an insider group, and I'm on the outside, but I'm trying to get in, and it can feel political. You know what I'm saying? Which is why I asked, that's where the question's coming from, is sometimes I feel like just being explicit about like your place and like what the rules are is less political and more transparent, and therefore maybe more democratic in my personal experience. That's why
again, like I really think the smaller the better. And if it is larger, like kind of division of labor, like you're going to worry about the decision making in this area. We're going to worry about this. This is your realm, this is our realm, but we do have to cooperate. But I think I've been to other Catholic workers where there is no process, and it's just a few like long-standing people who've been there for a long time basically call the shots. And so it's very unwelcoming to new people, just like what you were describing. Like, so like there's all sorts of different ways that I've seen houses run. In here, it's just really Renee and I. So, and even there, like, last night I answered the door pretty late for someone, and like, and it's like been a long day, and like, don't answer the door because then you're going to be lost for an hour, and and so like you're constantly, one guy used to say in Rochester, the Catholic worker, we live by the rules and we make new ones up every day, and that's oftentimes what can happen as well, so I don't know. I think a house of hospitality cooperate, like I think it's good. It's a good, if there's space for it, it is a good place to learn how to become cooperators or govern by consensus or make decisions by consensus. If the people because someone always starts it, like they don't just materialize. There's always a core group of people who start a Catholic worker. And it's just, so it's always someone's property. It's always someone's. So you got to find a way to create an environment where people have the opportunity to form themselves as cooperators. And that is a big risk, huge risk. But I think it also happens that people leave Catholic workers, and unhealthy people fill that vacuum and can rule a house in a way that's very unhealthy. And I've seen that as well. So it's like, it really comes down to the formation of the people that are making these decisions. And I think that's why roundtable discussions are really important. Like even today, I read a lot about, I was reading a lot of Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin when it came to politics. And I was like, man, I don't read them enough. And, so like sometimes I lose the vision, right? And if we're going to call ourselves agronomic universities, we really have to, that's such an important part of the formation of Catholic workers, I believe. So thanks for inviting me. That made me read a lot that I haven't done in a while.
Okay. So I guess before we pivot to talking more about how things are going in Harrisburg, do you have any, since you've gone back to the political vision, do you have any kind of like main takeaway beyond obviously the Catholic worker is meant to be a kind of bottom up pre-political, you didn't use that word, but I'll use it, kind of pre-political movement? What would you say the vision should be? Let's say we did live in a society where people were at least striving to be cooperators. How do you think our politics would look different?
Well, I think the Catholic worker vision is that there is no politics, or that there is no. When I think of politics, I can't separate myself from the government politics, or like the politics of a group dynamic. I think I think that question is difficult to answer because I can't envision right now what success would look like in this. The closest thing that I have would be the way Mondragon, the worker-owned cooperative in Mondragon, Spain, has operated, and its influence on the society, the city there. I think the politics, I guess what I hope for, what I envision is something where there's just a lot of smaller communities working and cooperating with one another, and not this big central federal government that is kind of getting stronger and stronger, it seems, but that is that everything is kind of drawn to them. Whereas in a cooperative society, there's going to be smaller communities working with one another and trade, educating. People are going to be experts in different things or have knowledge about different things and sharing it, and other people are going to need that. And so it sounds very utopian, but yeah, I think that's how I envision, or that's what I hope for. If that does that help? I feel like I'm confusing myself.
Well, and it's hard to talk about these hypothetical counterfactuals or whatever, or imagining how in practice things would look different if we theoretically started behaving differently. So it is tough. So I guess tell us a bit about what you're actually doing in Harrisburg and how that's shaping up.
So yeah, like I said in the opening, like we live in Allison Hill. It's a very poor neighborhood. Harrisburg is the state capital of Pennsylvania, so its main business is politics, ironically. But yeah, it's 47% African American, and another, I forget how it breaks down, but I think white is 13%. Caucasian makes up 13% of the population of Harrisburg. So we are in Allison Hill. We have a lot of Spanish speakers around us, and more we're meeting a lot of Haitian families around us. So there is a lot of work that we're doing with, especially the Haitians right now. They're so vulnerable. The government has, the Department of Homeland Security has ended their temporary protected status. They're losing their jobs, their work authorizations. They're being told to self-deport, even though there are no international flights to Haiti. So it's a big mess. And so we end up doing a lot of work with our neighbors. One of the questions you asked is, let me pull it down. What's its core ministry? And this is something that Renee and I have spoken a lot about. And I don't think we have a core ministry other than, I think what we're trying to do is just live out a life that is sacramental and Catholic, and that we're in our neighborhood, that we get to know our neighbors, they get to know us, and we just try to we try to find out how we can all help each other. And so even though we do end up doing a lot of work on behalf or with immigrants, like we're also in the lives of our neighbors. We'll babysit their kids. We'll give them rides to work. They'll make us dinner sometimes and bring it over. They'll, we in our farm we have some plot or some empty raised garden beds that that neighbors want to plant plants in, and so very slowly we're becoming a part of the neighborhood. And but we do kind of do the traditional kind of Catholic worker stuff in terms of, we do have hospitality hours. We open our doors once a week, every Wednesday, from 10 to 2, and you can come and get a shower. There's a lot of homelessness in Harrisburg. You can do laundry here. There's coffee, there's discussion. I think one of the great things is we have volunteers that come, and they just the ones who stick around, and they begin to make relationships with the people that come here, and then they start helping, and helping them get jobs and apartments. And so that's a lot of what we do. Renee writes a lot. She's a freelance journalist. So, and then I work part-time across the street from here. There's an after-school program for kids living in Allison Hill, where they send you to a private school. Mostly they go to Catholic schools, and then they go to it's kind of like a boys and girls club, but just for students in Allison Hill. And so there's tutoring and things like that. But I've gotten to know a lot of the students there. We've got a farm club going with the kids in the neighborhood. So there's all sorts of stuff that we should say no to, but we just are completely overextended. We can be writing motions for a Haitian family to get a court hearing change from in person to online. We can be getting someone a towel to take a shower. You just never know where it's going to go. And the biggest challenge, I think, is handling knocking on the door. There's just, because if you answer that door, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. And but that's a that's, I think, if you're going to say house of hospitality on the outside of your door or on your house, you got to try to find ways to answer that door and respond. So that's, we're part of Pax Christi. We team up with them a lot, especially with the Israeli and the conflict in the Middle East, in Yemen, and Ukraine. We're all over the place. I think just like a lot of other Catholic workers, we do a lot of good things really badly, I think is how I would generally characterize what we're doing. And I think part of the problem we have, because that's one of the things you guys ask about, is what are some of the challenges. I think the biggest challenge is, and I think, Spencer, you may know about this, we've talked about this, is having all these ideas on what it means to be Catholic, and to choose to live in voluntary poverty is very challenging to people. And so oftentimes it's pretty lonely. You're very much kind of on an island, and that can be difficult. But I think the biggest, we just don't have enough. We need more people. We don't need more money. We need more people. We had a seminarian here for about a month and a half during June and part of July. And one day he walks in and he's like, "Wow, you guys really need more workers." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm glad you recognize that. It's not that we need more money. It's not that we need more resources. We need more people." And we can do what we do because of voluntary poverty. Yeah, I think the seminarian really hit the nail on the head when he said that you need more workers. And that's the biggest that's the biggest obstacle I think we have right now. And but yeah, even though most people, Harrisburg is divided by the Susquehanna River, right? Like Harrisburg's on one side, and then on the other side is the West Shore, and that's kind of where all the money is. And you know, so yeah, we really feel we really could use more workers, because we really feel like this is a prime place to try a lot of these ideas, in terms of like a credit union and, you know, community land trust. The farm seems to be our most successful way of engaging our neighbors. You know, the kids love our chickens. You know, they're just so fascinated by it. But like, yeah, there's no banks in Allison Hill, and the ones that they do have, I'm sure, are exploiting them and charging them ridiculous fees for all sorts of things. And you know, we've been talking to the Simone Weil House in Portland. They started an interest-free lending program in conjunction with the Notre Dame Federal Credit Union. So we've been talking to them and figuring out how they're doing it, and we've been trying to find local partners here to launch a similar thing. You know, so, but we really need people who are very, we could use more workers. We could use more Catholic workers. But we're also meeting other organizations who share, you know, working with the homeless and immigrant, you know, migrant ministries and things like that. So we're really getting to know the lay of the land and talking about these ideas, talking about Catholic social teaching, and talking about, you know, what a credit union is and a community land trust. And, you know, so like that's where I find the hope in this, because yeah, people are looking for something different. I think they're looking, the institutions that we currently have now, political, our social institutions, education, religious churches, like they just all really feel ineffective. And I think it's prime time for Catholic, for the Catholic worker movement. I think we really have a lot to say about what is going on now and how we can respond. And but I think that requirement of voluntary poverty, not requirement, but the voluntary poverty, I think is what is a big obstacle to people. And you know, I think it's essential.
Why is it essential?
Well, I think for one, you're not attached to anything material, and it's a lot easier to put the primacy of the spiritual when you don't have these material obligations, so to speak. I think too, it puts you in solidarity with you know, the people that you're, you know, living with and working with. And I think it keeps you honest and creative. You know, there was a point in my life where I did make money, and I could always buy my way out of a situation, or, you know, make it easier somehow. And when you don't have money, you really have to be creative, and you know, you got to use your imagination. And but I think at the end of the day, Jesus was poor, and I think if we're going to imitate him, I think that falls in line. That's part of it too. And I've always been kind of flummoxed, I guess, by Catholics who, with the Eucharistic revival, and we're so ready to pronounce, we believe this is his body, this is his blood. We'll be happy to quote Jesus and believe that and take that literally. But when it comes to money and his that it's blessed are the poor and woe to the rich, and you cannot serve God and mammon, and those sell everything, give it to the poor, come follow me. Like, it's like, well, that's where he's speaking figuratively, or that's where he's, those are metaphors. And, I don't think, I think the saints and the lives of Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, I think, really show the importance of it. And you really have the opportunity to put your trust in God and not in your 401k and I know that's a scary thing. And that's, the biggest thing I learned that first year when I said I was just going to go in the Catholic Worker for 1 year mission, it didn't take me long to figure out, like, wow, you really don't need a lot to live. Like, you really just need, warm shelter, you need clothing, you need food. If you have those things, you really have everything you need. And, and so the rest of your time, the rest of your resources can be used and given to others. And that voluntary poverty, even though I work more now than I did when I was, in the secular world or whatever, but it doesn't feel like work. And yes, I'm tired, I'm exhausted some days, I'm burned out. And I realize, I understand why Dorothy prayed 3.5 hours a day or 4 hours a day. I can't do that. I haven't gotten there yet, but prayer is an important part of our daily routine. We start every morning with morning prayer. We do liturgy of the hours. But yeah, poverty can be good and honest, and you can still live a very rich life. We can still travel. We can still, it's just done a different way. If we travel somewhere, we need to find hospitality. We need to call ahead and beg for hospitality. And we never have a problem. We always find what we're looking for, what we need. And in the process, we get to meet other people instead of just getting a hotel room or Airbnb or whatever. We're in the homes of sometimes religious orders, sometimes strangers, sometimes acquaintances or people we haven't seen in a while. And, so I think poverty breeds community because there's kind of a shared neediness. So I think that's, and if you look at the saints, there weren't many rich saints. I'm not saying there aren't rich saints, but, St. Francis of Assisi and, just for people from orders, they don't really have a lot of money. It's not, so.
Right. Yeah. There were a few wealthy women that bankrolled the apostles, but
yes,
there's
yeah,
there
yeah.
Is, but yeah. So, but yeah, I think like you hit the nail on the head with the relationships. I think, this is probably what scares people the most, even more than not using their money or not having money. is like being kind of forced to have relationships with other people, or just, I mean, because I think people have gotten so used to very much picking and choosing. Like if they want to be a volunteer, they can volunteer for like 2 hours over here where they don't really know anybody, and then they can go away, and they don't have relationships. We're becoming a very relationship averse society, right?
Oh yeah.
So this is probably one of the big obstacles to people coming, is just being afraid of becoming embedded in relationships, and then how do I handle that? I'm sure this is also a cure for that, right? But I think this is
Yeah.
probably a big fear.
Yeah, well, I think people still want to keep up with the Joneses, right? They still, I think for young families with kids, they're gonna be like, well, I want to send my kids to, this school or that school, and I need money. And I mean, I think there's some real fears. But I think it's important to try to have. Yeah, I think poverty gives you faith in a way that I don't think you can have as ultra wealthy or well off. I think poverty, but I think too. I think what scares most people is not poverty per se, but they have this idea of what poverty is. So for a lot of people, they can't separate kind of that destitution versus holy poverty, as Dorothy Day might call it. And yeah, like I never worry about where I'm going to put my head. I never worry about if I'm gonna have food or not. Like I don't live a precarious type of poverty. I just don't have a savings account. I don't have retirement. Um, and that, the first thing when you talk about voluntary poverty, the first thing they ask are usually those types of questions. How do it's all about like retiring and um, how are you going to do medical and this and that. And like I understand that, but it's also like what's kind of killing us is all these, some people get security in our system, in our financial economic system, and a lot of people don't. And so it's more like, let me get what's mine, and then yeah, I'll go work at the soup kitchen for an hour or two a week, or I'll, whereas, Christianity by the early Christians, they call, it was the way. It was a way of life. It's a way of being and a way of existing together. And Dorothy Day writes about this all the time. That we believe in the early, the communal land and things like that. To each, their own, or what from Acts of the Apostles and like, yeah, I don't think that's, Christians are very afraid to actually live that out because we've kind of been given this, we've been formed in capitalism. We've been formed in security and in comfort, and get yours first. And then, like, I've spoken to a lot of high school, like Catholic high schools, and when I ask them what they want to do, they all say the same thing. Well, not all of them, but like, yeah, I want to get really rich, and then I'll help the poor. And it's like, I think, and it's really hard to convince someone, like, really, if you want to help the poor, like, you got to get really poor, and then you can be with the poor, and then you can help the poor, and then the poor can give you the solutions, because your solutions are unrealistic. You're not in touch with reality, and I think another thing that money does is it separates you from reality. Pope Francis called it the unreality. Many of us live in the unreality and the joy of the gospel. He wrote about this, and yeah, I think living in Allison Hill and I'm living in the reality. This is how most of the world lives, and actually far worse, most of the world. And, you know, so I think, yeah, poverty and I think the works of mercy, like those are the two, because the works of mercy kind of keep you aware. You're in touch with what people are experiencing and what their needs are, and what the solutions are. Because the solutions, the people who are suffering, they know better than anyone else what the answers to their problems are. So that's my bell. We'll see if someone answers it.
Well, and it seems to me that this whole voluntary poverty discussion, it basically recapitulates the why can't we cooperate discussion, because I feel like part of why people are scared to cooperate, if they even want to,
Yeah.
as soon as people go down this road to try and cooperate, then they have to confront the fact that we live like in a sociopathic, anti-cooperative society. And so they're afraid if I go out on a limb to try and cooperate, nobody's going to catch me, and then I'll be poor
Yeah.
and I'll die alone and miserable and diseased and whatever else they might, think.
Yeah, which is going to happen if you're rich, because everyone just wants your money.
Well, and that to me, whenever people bring up the healthcare thing, is like it's not like the option is like just die in misery and squalor, or you'll live forever in some transhumanist it's not like we're talking about escaping death. We're talking about hanging out in a hospital while you watch The View and wait to die.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but I do think, yeah, the poverty, I think that's, about the people who are poor get cooperate. They are cooperators. You need to be a cooperator in order to survive if you're poor, if you come from a poor background. I don't know if you guys ever heard of the drivers co-op in it started in New York City. I don't know how they're doing now, but they were trying to start like a driver-owned cooperative akin to like Uber or Lyft. And I was going to do an article on them for the Catholic Worker newspaper when I was in New York, and they had just started, and so they didn't have the technology to go head to head. And like I called, they just weren't working yet. I don't know how they're doing now. I think they're still around. But I met their leadership team, and it was, yeah, like I was the only white guy in the room, and they all had accents or were the sons and daughters of immigrants in living in New York. And we were talking about cooperatives and the guy who was basically, the president or like the leader, I asked him, like, how did you learn about cooperatives? Like what? And he's like, yeah, like I didn't know, like when someone approached me about this drivers co-op thing, I was like, yeah, that sounds like how I grew up. Like we have to cooperate. Like that's how we know what a cooperative is, or that's why we understand cooperatives better than Americans. Like I do think people outside of the United States who come from poor countries, or even people in poor communities in the United States, it's just a much more innate way of existence. So yeah, if you have wealth and poor, it's going to be hard to find. It's going to be hard for them to cooperate. So I don't know. Again, like this is where I think about this all the time. Like how can the Catholic Church play a role in creating cooperators? And I just don't think they have much of an interest in it right now. I don't think that there's any effort that I know of in the American Catholic Church to address, our economic systems with the solution of cooperativism. And to me, that's when I hear like the politics and the Supreme Court decisions and, the dialogue with different politicians and, Catholic lobbyists and like all this time and energy and money spent into influencing our political system by the Catholic Church. It's like we're not really reconstructing the social order at all. We're not evangelizing at all. We're just trying to get what we want. We're just, through political means. And I don't think that's the furthest away you can be from, like, that is not evangelizing at all. And you see it in so many different ways. I know the 10 Commandments, right? They've been trying to put the 10 Commandments into into schools, public schools. And maybe a year ago, the governor of Louisiana had this big photo op of a bill he was going to sign in a Catholic school legislating that all schools have the 10 Commandments in their classrooms. And yeah, I'm just like, that is stupid. Right? Like, and you're not, like, we've given up on evangelizing. We can't evangelize, so now we're going to legislate. We don't know how to evangelize. We can evangelize, we just don't know how to. And, so now we're going to legislate that, the 10 Commandments be in every classroom in Louisiana. And, Harry Murray's response was, that's all well and good, but why don't they put the Sermon on the Mount in all the classrooms? But it's just, yeah, to me, it's just like we don't know how to evangelize. We don't know how to cooperate. We're just in a lot of ways, it's like, it's all about liturgy. And, we just can't seem to talk to anyone else about anything other than the liturgy. And, for Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, I think the liturgy, like, everything flowed out of the liturgy. The liturgy is where it began. And, so politics.
That 10 Commandments thing's been going on forever. I've been hearing about that for like 35 years. Okay. Like Catholics, evangelical Protestants, they all want the 10 Commandments in the schools, and they want to put it on the sidewalk, and of course there's the abortion issue, right? And both of them are extremely boring, and as well as being off-putting. You're absolutely right that you go and you don't hear a thing. You don't hear a thing, right, of instructional value, and it becomes hard to kind of hang on, right, when the church isn't backing you up. I mean, do you feel that way sometimes? Like, how do you hang on when the church isn't?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that the church. I don't know if it's the church needs to back me up or us up. I just feel sometimes like our missions are completely different, and and then I'm like, well, what is, in the American context, what is this movement, this Catholic worker movement, mean to American Catholicism? How does it impact American Catholicism? But yeah, no, I think bishops and clergy and the vast majority of laity are pretty blind to how economic systems are hurting their fellow Americans and people all over the world. And I think that's, the Catholic worker started in the Great Depression They were trying to address economic problems, but the primacy of it was going to be done through the primacy of the spiritual, and that, you know, that's where it comes from. That's where without that, we do put God first, and then, you know, our neighbor, and that those two are related. And, you know, they did see, and they spoke to the problems of their day, which have only become worse today. And you know, so all of their ideas that they spoke about in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and up until her death in 1980, you know, they're still the same solutions, or the same, you know, Catholic actions, so to speak, of, you know, trying to start small cooperatives, trying to start worker-owned cooperatives, trying to start community land trusts. Yeah, I think the struggle goes on, and, you know, Dorothy Day talks about, like, work to expect failure, and I think, yeah, that's what I've experienced, and when trying to start these things, it's a lot of failure. And I think, yeah, if we're a faith of resurrection, then that failure will become something. And you know, but I do believe that we still, like, we're going to still keep trying, and I think other Catholic workers are trying. I do think that there's a lot of Catholic workers out there who are really looking at, you know, credit unions and cooperatives, and of all consumer owned, you name it, and I think that's an important part of the movement that I draw inspiration from. You know, maybe our society is far away, but I think that's the prophetic nature of Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin and the Catholic Worker Movement, that I find appealing. And, you know, I never would have come up with this stuff. This isn't Dorothy Day's idea, or Peter. These are like, you know, the program of the church. And I think that's, you know, that's what gets me excited about, yeah, being Catholic, that we have this incredible canon of writings on, you know, from spiritual to economics. Like, there's just so much in our faith, and I think Peter and Dorothy really understood that American Catholics had a different issue to deal with than maybe Catholics in the South of the world, or, you know, that we were dealing with a very capitalistic, you know, society, very individualism, and so their program, I think, was specifically tailored to, you know, to combating that, and forming a new Catholic. And, you know, I think that's pretty cool. I think that's, and I think, again, like, the Catholic worker movement really has a lot to say about we have a good critique. We've always had a good critique, I think, of modern society, but I think it's always come with some solutions and some ideas, and you know, it's up for us to carry that out. And I think it's that kind of action that will draw in people to the movement, and, well, to Catholicism too, or just Christianity. You know, that maybe these guys aren't so crazy. You know, that they're. But I really do believe that, yeah, the ideas that they've given us are, you know, are primed for the moment. You know, I think that's, but that it does require a little bit of faith, and, you know, part of that is, the voluntary poverty and things like that. But I think I think there are other ways of like beginning without, going 100%, like, oh, I'm going to sell everything, give it to the poor. And I really do. I think people, if there could just be more encountering of, like, more of a culture of encounter, rather than serving in a soup kitchen, going to have a meal in a soup kitchen, rather than, if you have time to talk to the person who's begging in the street, or really, or go to a Catholic worker and try to meet people, and like, but get involved in people's lives, because like that's where you really learn the injustice of all these systems that are completely broken, highly bureaucratic, and you'll be livid within a month. You'll just be like, this is crazy. How did I not know this? And I think it's those encounters that like change people's hearts. And I think the way we do service now doesn't offer that opportunity. I can't stand signing service, those papers like that a student will bring you. Because like, why are you doing this? What's the motivation here? And but then again, maybe that encounter will happen. But I feel like we've commodified service as well. It's there's no end to what we can commodify in our culture right now.
Then, as you say, the struggle continues for us to be faithful and live our lives as best we can.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, James, and sharing what you know.
Thank you. Thanks for all the work you guys do. It's awesome. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, James. It was great.